So I'm proud to be here. We have the photos of Sebastião Salgado, because this place will be named Casa Cop. We're starting lots of debates, events here, starting in June to the end of the year. I cannot register about Azambuja, as you all know, Marcos, but I'll have here decided with Pedro Malan we're going to do no, in the end, in the conclusion. And I'm very happy to have Arthur here. Arthur is a great friend, a partner for SEBRI, for CBC. He's been coming to Rio since 2005 to 2006. We did a review yesterday, and then the first time we met was 2007 when we had a big conference at the China-Brazil Business Council. And the world has changed a lot, and especially this year. So he said to me yesterday, we had dinner, he said, Trump is the easiest part. So I think we should start. So thank you so much, Arthur, to be here, and all of you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julia, for that kind introduction. It's great to be back here, and it's wonderful to be in this beautiful new space surrounded by these fantastic images from Sebastião Salgado. So great honor to be able to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I think what we're going to try and do is I'm going to try to keep my remarks to about 20 to 25 minutes, and that should leave us a good half hour for questions and discussion. Julia's correct. I said in one sense Trump is very simple, and I'll explain why in a moment, but his simplicity creates a lot of complications for everyone else, and that's what we're dealing with. And of course, overnight we had some very interesting news, which is that a court in the United States that governs international trade has declared that almost all of the tariffs that he has imposed this year are illegal. So this creates I think, an interesting situation where clearly this is going to continue to be litigated. Trump has already appealed. We don't know exactly what shape this is going to take. But I think, among other things, it restores my faith, at least temporarily, a little bit in the American system, that there are checks and balances that are functioning, at least to some degree. But as I'll say in a minute, I think we need to also be a little bit cautious about what we think this means for U.S.-China relations, because at the same time that ruling was coming through, we've had a couple of other developments which suggest that the relationship between the United States and China is going to get worse relatively soon. So, and I'll come back to that in a second. But let me first, so essentially I have two topics that I want to deal with here. One is just the immediate issue of what's going on with the trade wars generally, and specifically with relation to China. And then I have a couple of observations about where China is headed in the long run and what this means for U.S.-China relations. And hopefully I'll be able to wrap all those remarks up by 9 o'clock, so there's plenty of time to talk. Okay, so on the trade wars, and again, everything has been altered a little bit by the court's decision last night, but until last night, this is where we were. That despite the fact that Trump had retreated on the very high tariffs that he announced on April 2nd, both for the rest of the world and then later for China, even so, you were still left with very high tariff levels. So what this shows is, the long-run tariff rates, and you can see that in 2018, in the first trade war, Trump tariffs on China went up. The official rates were 20-25%, but then when you just do an effective calculation where you say, what are the imports from China and what is the tariff revenue coming from those, it wound up being about 10%. So that was the state of affairs coming into this year. On the rest of the world, there really were not significantly higher tariffs on most things. And what Trump has done is he has raised tariffs on the rest of the world to 10%. That's the small blue arrow. And on China to somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 or 50%. It's actually very difficult to calculate what the true rate is. And so the lighter red lines show what he threatened to do and has now backed off from. And, you know, the point I've been making to our financial clients as I've gone around Sao Paulo the last few days is that the markets seem very happy that we only have 10% tariffs on the whole world and 40% in China. But 6 months ago or 7 months ago, when Trump was running for election and saying that this was exactly what he was going to do, 10% on the world and 40 or 50% on China, everyone said, oh, he can't possibly do that. That's outrageous and ridiculous, and it would be very, very bad. So the question, one question here is, was everyone wrong that tariffs at this level would be bad? Can we just accept them as a normal state of affairs? And my answer to that is no. And I think the reason that the markets have been so comfortable relatively with these high levels of tariffs that we've been left with over the last few weeks is, first of all, they're better than what we were looking at on April 2nd, so there was an anchoring effect. But then the other thing is that the impacts of these have yet to cycle through. They don't have an instant impact. They only started collecting the tariff revenue last month. So I think we are still likely to see, if the tariffs stick, which they may not, but if they do, I think we're still likely to see significant negative impacts on the U.S. economy, lower growth, higher inflation. And I think the biggest impacts are going to be long run, not in the next 2 months, but the next several years. Because if the U.S. maintains this posture, they're basically going to undermine the attractiveness of the U.S. as an investment location, because a lot of what the U.S. imports is not consumer goods, it's industrial goods. They're raising the cost of production in the United States. They're basically trying to terrorize the universities and kick out international students, which are a very important part of U.S. competitiveness. So they're, you know, taking aim at the most high-value part of the workforce, and they're introducing a lot of unpredictability. So I think the medium to long-term impact of this on the United States is going to be quite severe if it sticks. And I think that hasn't been fully sort of accepted by the markets. But stepping back from this, you know, I want to give you my theory of what is going on here, because there's been a lot of confusion, and people keep asking, what is it that Trump really wants? It's not so clear. And this is what I was remarking to Julia last night. I think Trump is very simple. He likes two things. He likes money and he likes power. The end. That is all that motivates him. And you can see this in all the things that he's been doing through meme coins and going to Qatar and getting a $400 million airplane, et cetera, et cetera. He does a lot of things basically driven by the desire to enrich himself and his family. And then as a politician, basically what he wants is to increase his power and increase the power of the United States through which he acts. And that's it. He doesn't have really policy ideas that move him. He doesn't have really a vision of what he wants the U.S. to become, other than some nostalgic version of what he thinks it was in the 1950s. He's not really serious, in my opinion, about reindustrializing the United States. He may think he is, but he's not really. What he really wants is to exert power, amass power, exert it, and have everyone else in the world and in the country acknowledge him as a powerful person. And he likes tariffs, and here I have to put a little asterisk around my remarks because of the court. He likes tariffs because until yesterday, basically, he was taking the view that U.S. law, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, gave him unlimited authority to impose any tariff that he wanted on any country at any time for any reason. So it was a very flexible weapon, and he's used it not just for trade issues, but to punish countries supposedly for letting in too many illegal immigrants into the United States, or for not enforcing their drug laws, or for not spending enough on defense. In this case, which he just lost, he made the argument that he needed the tariffs because otherwise he could not keep the peace between India and Pakistan, right? So he really thinks that tariffs are this all-purpose tool that can be used for everything, and it seemed like he was going to be able to get away with it. Now, what's important about the ruling last night is the International Trade Court basically rejected, in much harsher terms than I think anyone expected, all of his claims and said that these tariffs are just flat out illegal and there's no justification for them whatsoever. And the strength of that opinion, which was unanimous among three judges, one of whom was appointed by Trump, I think has given a lot of people some hope that this will stand up under appeal. But I think we need to be a little bit careful because what this means is that Trump cannot use this particular legal authority for tariffs. He will have to find other legal authorities. The other legal authorities are a little bit harder to use for the kinds of very broad tariffs that he wants. They need to be given for a reason, and they have to be narrower. But Trump is, and the people around him are very creative, and I think they're going to be working very hard, first of all, on contesting this ruling and dragging it out and taking it up to the Supreme Court. And it's possible that the tariffs will remain in effect until you get a final ruling there, which could be many months down the road. And I think they will also be very aggressive at finding other legal mechanisms by which they can impose some version of the current tariffs. So we are in a little bit of a state of confusion here, but I would not underestimate the desire of Trump to find a way to use tariffs because he just loves them as a tool, and they are very, very flexible. And there isn't sort of another tool that works as well for him. So we're not out of the woods by any means yet. The other thing I would observe is that at the same time that we were getting this ruling, two other things came down in the last couple of days. One is that the Trump administration has expanded export controls in the semiconductor sector to include software, design software for chips, and they've essentially told, or there's a report yet to be confirmed, that they have told U.S. companies that they are not allowed to sell this design software to Chinese chip design firms. If this is true, this is a significant escalation of the U.S. tech controls, and it is bad news, I think, for U.S.-China relations. The other thing, which I think in some ways is even more alarming, is Secretary of State Rubio came out yesterday and confirmed that the U.S. is not only reviewing the applications of all international students in the United States, but is aggressively moving, his words, to revoke the visas of Chinese students that he believes are, agents of the Communist Party, which possibly could mean all Chinese students in the United States. There are certain people in the Trump administration who think there should be zero Chinese students in the United States. Right now, there are about 300,000. And they are a very, very important part of the tech ecosystem in the United States. So at the same time that we've had a tariff ceasefire that everyone was very happy about, the administration has been moving in other ways to become much more aggressive with China. So I think we still have a lot of complications to come. All right, so that's the U.S. side. Let me talk a little bit about how things look from the China side. And for those of you who don't know, I have spent most of my career since the early 1990s working in China or in and about China, and I set up my company there in 2002. I don't live there anymore, but I go there frequently. The thing that has puzzled me is that after April 2nd happened, China was the only country in the world that retaliated against Trump's tariffs. And this obviously created an escalation and a lot of problems. And the question is, why would China do this, given that they are very export dependent and this is very risky? And I think the reason for it is that, number one, because they went through a trade war with Trump in 2018 and 2019, and had to face the subsequent export and investment controls imposed by the Biden administration, they've been spending the last 5 or 6 years creating Fortress China of self-sufficiency, reducing their reliance on U.S. technology imports, and basically getting ready for the next war. So the baseline was, I think China felt that it was well prepared for a very fierce struggle with the United States because of the work that they've done over the last few years. Second is that they've created a bunch of tools to inflict pain on the United States, mainly through their own export controls on certain technology products and critical minerals that are important for technology and defense applications. So they felt that they had more ability to fight back this time than last time. I think they were very frustrated that they had made some overtures to Trump in January and February about, what they could do to solve the trade issues, and in particular, they'd made some specific commitments or offers on restricting fentanyl precursor flows to Mexico, which is a big issue. And they got no response, literally no response. They could not get anyone in the Trump administration to meet them at all. So I think they were feeling that the United States was not really negotiating in good faith. And then the final point is, I think Xi Jinping made the judgment that if there was a trade war with very high tariffs on both sides, this would be bad for China. It would reduce exports. It would create more deflation pressure. It's clearly not his choice A. But he felt that whatever pain China had, it would be less than the pain in the United States, which would suffer not only weaker growth but also higher inflation, and that China could outlast the United States in any conflict. And basically, I think the agreement that they reached in Geneva proved that point exactly correctly. The United States was unable to sustain these tariffs at that level and had to back down. And I guess the final point I would make in terms of where we go from here is that the Chinese have been quite clear in many communications over the last few months that they're, number one, they're very happy to negotiate with the United States over trade. And there's a lot that they're willing to do, particularly in terms of increasing their purchases of certain U.S. products. But they do not want to do a repeat of the Phase 1 trade deal from 2020, which consisted of a long list of obligations on China and no obligations on the United States. Their position is if there is a deal now, China has to get something specific and material. So we can't just go back to what we did 5 years ago. And unfortunately, that's a very difficult condition for the United States to meet because Trump, another characteristic of Trump is that I don't think, despite his reputation, I don't think he does deals. A deal is where I give something, you give something, there is some compromise. He hates to do a deal in which he has to give up anything. So he will extract concessions and he will grant favors. But if you say, can we bind into a long-term agreement, something that you have to do for me, he's very reluctant. So that, I think, creates a challenge. So just a couple of words on the Chinese leverage over the United States, because this is going to come back when I talk about the sort of longer-term issues. Essentially, what the Chinese know is that the United States industrial supply chain is much more reliant on stuff that they import from China than the other way around. Chinese companies don't really depend that much outside of semiconductors on things that they import from the United States. So this chart shows this. The red bars show the level of dependence on Chinese imports of different U.S. sectors. You can see, in some sectors it's pretty large. It's between 15 and 12%. And, those numbers may not seem that high, but in many cases these are components which, if you don't have them, you cannot make your final product. And China has a number of these kinds of things, notably in the critical minerals space, where there are a number of specialty minerals that are really critical for production of both new energy equipment and defense equipment. And you can see, if you look at the list of all of these minerals, and then you look at the second column, applications, you will see that defense is in every single one of them. And then you look at the next column, and you see that China typically controls between 50 and 90% of the global refined, processed output of these products. And in the fourth column, you can see that U.S. is almost entirely import dependent on for all of these things, which means that they are very heavily reliant on China. And it is not easy to substitute, although many of these, everyone knows that rare earths are not really rare, they exist everywhere. However, to process them is very environmentally difficult, and it requires certain kinds of technologies that China now has a lock on. So if you want to use these things, you don't just dig them up, you have to get them processed. That usually means sending them to China, and it's very, very difficult to create alternative processing facilities. So this is a real a power that China has. They also has, and I won't go through this, they have various other things that they can do in terms of making life difficult for U.S. companies or not buying U.S. stuff. They have real leverage, and I think they're taking a fairly hard line in negotiations. Now, the question now is, what is the space? We have a ceasefire agreed to a couple of weeks ago where both sides reduced their tariffs. What is the space for negotiation? And I would essentially say that there's two ways to look at this. There's the short term, which is the next 3 months, and then the longer term, which is the next 1 or 2 years. In the next 3 months, so as you're probably aware, basically Trump has imposed a 90-day negotiation deadline, both on the world, basically, and that deadline runs till July 9th. And the China deadline, the clock started later, it started in May, so that runs till August 10th. And so Trump's plan was to negotiate 90 trade deals in the first 90 days. So far he has one with the UK, so at that rate he'll be done by somewhere late in his third term if he has one. I think my baseline association, and again, all of this is now conditional on this court decision, but my baseline assumption is that even leaving the court decision aside, once they got to 90 days, in most cases they would not put the tariffs back on, even if they didn't have a deal, basically because it would just be too economically damaging for the United States. So they're more likely to roll over the negotiation deadline. And I think there's a good chance that they'll do that with China as well. But what I want to suggest here is there is an opportunity for a short-term deal, if Trump wants it, with China, specifically on fentanyl, because I had showed you before, if you look at the structure of U.S. tariffs on China, no one knows exactly what they are, but they're in the order of 40 or 50%. And about half of that, 20%, represents tariffs put on ostensibly because China was not doing enough to control the flow of fentanyl precursors from chemical companies in China to drug labs in Mexico. The Chinese have already done 2 deals with the United States on fentanyl, one in 2019 where they restricted or blocked the sale of fully processed fentanyl to Mexico. That worked. And another deal last year where they restricted flows of precursor chemicals. They could still do more, and they've said that they are willing to do more. So if Trump wants to do a deal tomorrow under which China does more drug enforcement and the U.S. reduces or eliminates those 20% tariffs, that could be done. That's very easy. And my concern here is not that Trump doesn't want that deal. He might, but that his trade negotiators, Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer, that they don't want a fentanyl deal. Because the reality is that they don't care really much about fentanyl. They care about whatever the trade issues are. And so why would they give up half of their leverage in exchange for something that they don't care about? So I think that's an interesting question. There's a possibility of the sides coming together for a deal. It would be very positive if that happens because it shows that they're negotiating and it shows that they're trying to, get to a better place. But we'll have to see whether that happens. And of course, the problem now is that the court has said these fentanyl tariffs are illegal. So if you're China, it's like, okay, why should we negotiate to remove tariffs that have been ruled by illegal and may go away anyway? So I think all of these trade negotiations are now in a state of flux because if countries, China or anyone else, take seriously their court ruling, they have no incentive to negotiate because they're literally negotiating over nothing. So we will have to see how that goes. if we look beyond that, I think whatever happens in the tariff, clearly Trump would like to put pressure on China and would like to get some kind of a trade deal. What would this look like? And as I've suggested, the problem is the easiest thing to do is to go back to the deal that was done in 2020, the so-called Phase 1 trade deal, where China promised to buy 200 billion more items, $200 billion worth more items from the United States. They didn't really do that. So you could go back and say, you really need to do that, and plus there's more. And the Chinese have basically said, that's not enough. We need to get something. And what do they want? Well, there are three things that they want. One is for all tariffs to be eliminated. I don't think that's going to happen because Trump will find some legal justification for some tariffs that he can use. They want the reduction or elimination of export controls. Well, Trump has just increased export controls, so that doesn't look very likely. The third thing that they want is the ability of Chinese companies to invest in the United States. And here, I think Trump would be very open. He said numerous times during his campaign that he would be very happy if Chinese electric car companies came to the U.S., set up factories, employed U.S. workers, et cetera. And the rest of the U.S. elite does not buy this. They think China is an enemy and that investment is bad. But Trump uniquely would be able to overturn that because he has these powers to get people to believe the opposite of what they believed yesterday. And, I think if you look at the structure of the deals that he did in the Middle East, most of that was U.S. exports and investments to Saudi and the UAE, but he also talked about these trillions and trillions of investment that were going to come the other way into the U.S. So that's clearly something that he's interested in, that he would like, that he can claim as a victory. So there is an opportunity there that Trump has that no other U.S. leader would have. I think the problem is that there's a lot of opposition within the U.S. He would have to overcome that in order to do this. And I'm also, I have to say, I'm very concerned about the statements now about Chinese students because, if the U.S. is basically saying and goes through with this threat to expel large numbers or possibly all Chinese students from the U.S., I don't think that it's conceivable that you could then turn around and welcome Chinese investment in the United States. I just don't think those two things fit together. So we'll have to see how that other thing plays out and whether the Trump administration can settle into a clear trajectory of whether they want some kind of accommodation of China or if they just want a full-on Cold War. So that then gets me to my last set of points, which is I basically want to, just talk a little bit about, essentially the question of are the United States and China headed to a Cold War? And if so, what does that mean? And part of the answer to this question, depends on an assessment of, where China is. And China, I think, is kind of an interesting position where its economy is growing a lot slower than it was a few years ago. It's got severe deflationary problems. I'm happy to talk in detail about stuff in the Chinese economy in the discussion period, if you like. But the main point is that because of this slowdown growth and because of the deflation, China is no longer catching up with the United States in total economic size. So this is just China's economy at market exchange rates as a percentage of the United States economy. And you can see from 2005 until basically the COVID pandemic, China had caught up very rapidly in the same way that Japan caught up in the 1980s and 1990s. China got to about 75% of the size of the U.S. economy, and now it's down considerably. And it may start to stabilize. I don't think we're going to head into the Japan scenario. But it's now not at all clear that China's economy will ever be as large as the United States. Now, I mean, if Trump succeeds in all of the things that he's trying to do, then they probably will, because the U.S. economy will start to grow much more slowly. But if you assume that the U.S. can maintain, 2.5% growth, ad infinitum, it's going to be pretty tough for China to catch up at current rates. However, if you look just at manufacturing capacity, the story is completely different. This is manufacturing value added as a share of the global total. China is now at 33%, heading by many estimates up to 40 or more within the next 10 years. They have an industrial economy that is now larger than the US, Germany, Japan, and Korea combined. The technology innovation system in China is now very self-sustaining. It does not require high rates of domestic economic growth to continue because the manufacturing competitiveness is very strong. The companies are very good. They are able continuously to lower their prices so they can keep selling within the domestic market, and they're very competitive internationally. So this is the problem set that the United States is looking at, is maybe we don't have to worry about China as a bigger economy, but we do have to worry about China as a much bigger manufacturing base and a much more technologically sophisticated power. And so you have a lot of people in the United States saying that we should be in a Cold War, or are already in a Cold War with China. And I'm deeply opposed to this way of characterizing it because I think it forgets what the Cold War was. So this is economically, if you look at the bottom line here, which is U.S. trade with the Soviet Union and its successor states, that's what a Cold War looked like, right? There was basically no trade, no investment flows between the two major powers. There were two distinct blocks which did not interoperate at all. There was some scientific cooperation and whatnot, but economically they were completely separate. And that is just not what China has been. You look at China's share of U.S. trade, it zoomed up. It supposedly has gone down, but I have another chart, which I won't show here, but basically that misstates the reality. If you account for Chinese exports that go through third countries, Chinese share of U.S. imports is the same today as it was 8 years ago. It has not gone down at all. Moreover, China has bigger trading relationships than the United States with 140 countries in the world. And it's the second biggest provider of direct investment in the world behind the United States. It's all over the place. You know very well in Latin America that China is an increasingly important economic partner. So there's no relationship at all between China's place in the global economy and the Soviet Union's place in the global economy. So, and that is a very important and fundamental fact strategically, right? Because the way the Cold War worked was there was a U.S. bloc and there was a Soviet bloc, and the U.S., basically in its bloc provided an umbrella for enormous economic growth and opportunity, and the Soviet Union didn't, and so that, created conditions under which basically the Cold War ended and the U.S. won, right? Today, that is not the case. China is, wherever the U.S. is, China is also, and in many cases, China is more there in terms of trade investment. And China knows that what the United States would like to do is set up a bloc of countries to oppose China. And China's counter strategy to that is not to set up its own bloc. Their strategy is to say, let's have deep economic relations with every country in the world so that they will never join a U.S. bloc. It is an anti-bloc strategy. It is not a counter-bloc strategy. And I think it's been very effective. And I think, the impression that I have is that, after April 9th, Scott Bessent said his strategy in trade negotiations was to do a lot of deals with other countries first and then present a united front against China. So basically to create an anti-China bloc. And I think what they have discovered is they've gone to countries and said, will you join our bloc? They have all said, no. Why would we do that? That's insane. We have too much at stake in our economic relationship with China. I think what we have is a much more complicated situation where the U.S. and China are both very large, very interdependent with each other and with the rest of the world. They are operating competing networks of influence. And so there is a very long competitive situation in front of us. Neither country is going to go away, although Trump is doing his best to damage the U.S. prospects in this competition. I don't know exactly where we're going. And in the Trump administration, there are basically two pathways, right? One pathway is what I suggested is in the deal space. If he wants to do a deal on fentanyl, if he wants to do a deal on Chinese investment in the United States, he can do those. And that would take us away from a more hostile approach. And that would, I think, be good. But he has other people in his administration, like Rubio, who basically want to kick out every Chinese person in the United States and try to set up something as close as they can get to a Cold War mentality, if not a Cold War reality. And it's not at all clear which side of the Trump administration is going to win that yet. So I think with that, I will stop. Hopefully this has given you a lot to think about, and so we can spend a little bit of time in questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. So we will have half an hour on questions and debate. So good morning, Patricia.
Yeah. Yes.
Do I need a mic?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, I'm Patrizia Antonini with ANSA Press Agency, which is the Italian press agency here in Latin America. I had an impression, I don't know, I want to share with you my analysis. I had the impression that Trump administration imposed the tariffs as well in order to counter the growing transactions are going on within the BRICS bloc. The BRICS bloc is becoming more and more stronger. We're seeing what they're talking about with this local money transactions.
Right.
And they're always talking about this new Euro BRIC.
Yep.
So I was wondering whether you share something of this analysis. Like, more than an offensive is a defensive.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's a couple elements to that. I guess, first of all, I would say, I think it's very clear that there was not much of a strategy behind Trump's initial trade announcements. It wasn't being crafted by his trade officials. It was being crafted by Trump himself sitting in the White House with Peter Navarro, who the technical economic term for Peter Navarro is a crazed fruitcake. He's just a nut job. And they were just saying tariffs are good, trade is bad, let's hit as many people with as much tariffs as we can, and that will be good, right? That was literally all there was. So the question is there, over time, is it going to become a little bit more clear? I don't get the sense that, I think where I would agree with you is that I think all of this is driven by a sense of U.S. insecurity that they're losing control over the global system, right? That is the root cause of this. We ran the whole show. It was great. Now other people have more power. I'm a little skeptical, actually, about the BRICS per se, but I think the point is that many countries have a lot more autonomy to do things in defiance of the U.S. than they used to. And so the U.S. doesn't like that, and so the U.S. is kind of lashing out and saying, can we stop this, right? So I agree with a sort of a general, the general point that you're making there. Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical of these efforts to create alternatives to the U.S. dollar, whether through a unified BRICS currency or a digital currency or whatever. The obstacles to doing that in terms of actually getting high volumes of transactions are extremely high. The flexibility and the low friction of the dollar system is extremely powerful, and I think it's really impossible to overcome in normal times. I think what is occurring, though, and this is of some concern to the U.S., is that it's not so much the BRICS currency as the digital currencies that China's been working on and the payment systems. I think China is fairly close to coming up with a system that in normal times is not going to be that important. But if you get into another Ukraine war situation where countries have to find an alternative to the dollar system as an emergency measure to transact with each other, that will be much easier, right? So it's not that the dollar is going away in normal times. It's that in abnormal times there will be an alternative that can allow countries to evade U.S. sanctions, and I think the U.S. is very concerned about that. So tariffs aren't precisely targeted at that, but the general sort of drift of U.S. policy is definitely responding, I think, to the forces that you're talking about there.
Thank you. Now I'll pass to Minister Pedro Malan.
I think this is an excellent presentation. I wonder whether you could elaborate on the two things related to the fascinating paradox involved. It was the U.S., under U.S. leadership, that in the immediate post-war period, you have the building up of the system of relationships in trade and finance and United Nations, and which allowed for a remarkable period of growth in the world economy at large, including China.
Yeah.
The China history would not be written the way it was if it were not for the fact that China linked to the world economy, the realms of trade and finance and technology and education. So it was China's integration in the world economy which allowed this remarkable performance, which now is a source of concern to the U.S. You mentioned that in the first Trump administration, there were some negotiations there involved, and the Chinese started to prepare for possible future challenges of the same sort. I wonder whether you could comment on the fact, I think this started with Xi Jinping there. I should remember the Made in China that started in 2015 with a clear plan to 2025 for having Made in China there, and identification of the areas in which China would seek leadership in technology progress. I think there is one lesson in the world in the last few years has been that innovation power is the key factor determining the weight and the geopolitical transactions in the world today. And China has shown a remarkable, highly successful experience on that, including send millions of Chinese students to the best universities in the world to study science, engineering, computer science, biology, and they have created an enormous capacity for innovation. And I think the United States has waken up a bit too late late in the game for that, and now trying to recover the ground lost to China. But I wonder whether if you could make a brief comment on that, and if you have time. We're talking about the two largest economies. The fundamental bilateral relationship in the world is the U.S.-China relationship. But we're talking about a $29 trillion economy and an $18 trillion economy. They together represent 45% of the world's economy. So when two giants are engaging in competition, including tariff wars, this affects the rest of the world as a whole, including the United States. So the fascinating paradox in the story is that the U.S. was a builder of the post-war world, as we know, and now under Trump, it's being seriously damaged by this, including acting on his own allies. I'm talking specifically about Europe, and I wonder if you could mention a little bit about Europe, because Europe, if you take the UK, it's similar to the size of the Chinese economy. It's not a player to be dismissed as irrelevant because they cannot get their acts together. And the other thing is that you mentioned Russia. I wonder whether you could say something, because I'm concerned with Taiwan here. So you could say something about China, Taiwan, because China and Russia are very much related now in the fundamental alliance on the question of the China's support for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Trump has a vision about Russia. You mentioned when he likes power and powerful people, has personal relationships with powerful people. He says very good things about Putin. He says very good things about Xi Jinping, that we have a personal relationship. He lies that he received a phone call from Xi, which he didn't. But I wonder whether you could say something about Europe, and if Trump doesn't care much about Taiwan, if China could, with some time, think that Trump, in fact, would not bother much about what China do vis-à-vis Taiwan in the near future. I'm saying I'm talking too much. If you don't need to answer it now, maybe you could listen to other questions, and then you at the end you could comment on everything.
Yeah, no, I'm actually happy to take up those things because I think you've identified a number of really important points that it's useful to address. So first, on your point about this paradox of the U.S. undermining the order that it created, absolutely, and I think that basically reflects Trump. Trump does not care about the order. Trump hates order because it gets in the way of his personal exercise of power. He's a demagogue and a person with essentially an authoritarian bent. And so he hates the international economic order because it gets in the way with the unilateral exercise of power by the United States or by himself, right? So I think that's partly his pathology, and partly it reflects, I think, a broader misunderstanding within certain parts of the American conservative establishment about the sources and roots of U.S. power, right? And what they don't understand is the U.S. created this extraordinary, essentially imperial system that operated a lot through economic mechanisms, alliance structures, and soft power. And it was extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily cheap, actually. This is what's extraordinary is Trump thinks that he's being ripped off because the Europeans don't pay enough for their defense, and they should pay more for their defense, that's for sure. But if you look at the total cost to the U.S. of maintaining this extraordinary system of power and influence, it's actually been very, very low because it doesn't require the constant exercise of hard power. It uses the economic levers. So that's just, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding by people who have a very crude understanding of how the world works, and that's very unfortunate. And we'll have to see whether the U.S. system is able to to respond to that. But it is a paradox, but I think it reflects a kind of a pathology in Trump and a pathology in a certain part of the U.S. System. In terms of the specific relationships that you talked about, I think one thing that you sort of hinted at, and I don't know if this is what you were asking, but I'll address it anyway, is that there is this idea out there that has gotten revived because of a New York Times article and various other things, that what Trump is aiming for is a spheres of influence world in which the U.S. has its sphere and Russia has its sphere and China has its sphere and everyone gets what they want. And so this ties into the idea that he just wants to let Putin take over Ukraine, that he'll be happy to let the Chinese take over Taiwan and so forth. I don't agree with this because that would make Trump look like too much of a loser. He wants to maximize U.S. power and influence. He does respect Putin and Xi as strong leaders, but he wants them to recognize him as the strongest of all leaders. And if they do things that defy him, he gets really mad. And you look at what he's saying about Putin right now, and that's very clear. He was very buddy-buddy with him until it became clear that Putin was playing with him and was not going to do what Trump wanted, which was to make a ceasefire with Ukraine. And now he's talking about more sanctions, right? So I don't really think that at the end of the day, Trump wants to look like a loser by letting these other powerful figures get what they want. That is not what he's after. So I don't think the spheres of influence idea holds up. He basically just wants the U.S. to be a complete unilateral power, like the way that it was in the immediate after World War II, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's just completely unrealistic. In terms of a couple of the other issues that you brought up, so yeah, the position of Europe is very interesting and difficult. Obviously, they're a large economy, but they're very fragmented politically, so they punch below their weight politically, and I think that's just structural. On a values basis and historically, they obviously have a lot more in common with the United States than with China. And I think it's also important to recognize that in Europe, the Chinese support for Russia in the Ukraine war was viewed in catastrophic terms. They view the Ukraine war as an existential problem for Europe. It basically undermines the entire post-war order, and China put itself on the wrong side of that equation. That was incredibly damaging. And I think that severely limits what can be done in terms of EU-China cooperation to offset the United States. Because if you look at the statements from von der Leyen, who's been very clear about this throughout her term, if you look at where Friedrich Merz seems to be heading, none of these people really trust China all that much. And they're very concerned not only about the economic component, the political component, but also what Chinese competitiveness can do to European industry. So yeah, I think tactically they'll be willing to do a few things with China to try and put a little bit more pressure on Trump. But strategically, I think it's very difficult for them to align more with China. And I think from China's standpoint, they don't think it's worth it because they think Europe, the strategy with Europe is divide and conquer because it's 27 countries. They can always play one off against another. They don't need, as I said, they don't need a bloc. They just need Europe not to be so fully committed to the U.S. that it has a coordinated anti-China strategy. So if they can do that by divide and conquer, they'll be fine. And then finally, you touched on Taiwan. My view on this is actually this is something that probably in the next few years does not have to be as high profile an issue as it's been. I think the Chinese do not really want to engage in a high-risk maneuver over Taiwan anytime soon. Number one, I don't think that they are confident that it would succeed. Number two, Xi has recently fired basically all of his top military leadership, so he needs time to reconstruct his leadership and have people that he can trust. Number three, and most important, and this I think gets back to my sort of economic arguments here, is I think we underestimate how much the Taiwan relationship is useful for China in its present form, right? They get a lot of technology from Taiwan. A lot of Taiwanese live in China. They're engineers. They help the technology development there. It actually, in most respects, it works very well. And China does not have the headache of trying to govern Taiwan. So the status quo is not so bad for China. And so the cost to them, the hurdle rate, as we would say in finance, for them to change that status quo is quite high. So I think they'll be conservative there as long as they are confident that the United States is not pushing very hard for Taiwan independence. And again, I think this is something where a lot is going to depend on what Trump does. I think personally Trump would be happy to give the Chinese assurances that we don't want to support Taiwan independence, we're not going to sell them so many arms, whatever. But there are also plenty of people in his administration who think that the U.S. should be doubling down on support for Taiwan, which in my view would be a little bit dangerous, frankly. So we have, I guess what all of this illustrates is we have a very complicated international environment. Other questions?
Albert.
Yeah.
Please, Albert.
Well, thank you very much for your very enlightening presentation. It's been very interesting. And I think you spoke a lot about what's going on, what's the next steps from Trump, vis-a-vis China and all that. My question is how is the American society reacted to that? What is your expectation for the future regarding this society in America, the business context, and also the political context in America? Are they kind of realizing that effectively they elected an autocrat to run the company, to run the country, especially with the view regarding third countries like ours, for instance, that they want to impose sanctions on the Supreme Court justice based on the decision that has been rendered by our judicial power?
I wish I could answer that question with confidence, but I can't. You know, one thing that's been striking in the first few months of the Trump administration is how little resistance there's been. This is very different than the first Trump administration, where there were large-scale protests almost immediately and a lot of very strong pushback by different parts of society, including the corporate sector. And this time, basically, everyone has rolled over and everyone is scared, it seems like. Does that change? I hope it does. And, you know, I think it will change if you start to see material economic damage as a result of this, which I think should occur. I think you're going to get weaker growth. I think you're going to get higher inflation. You know, stock market is not doing very well. Or, I mean, yesterday it was great because they loved this court decision. But if the economy continues to roll along in an okay way, and you don't get a lot of sort of pocketbook damage, it seems like there's a lot of willingness in the United States to go along with this for a while, and you don't really have a test until the midterm elections in November of next year, which is 18 months away. So I would like to think that we're beginning to see, some pushback. But I think it's pretty fragmented, and the political opposition really has not coalesced yet. And, remember, America's a very inward-looking country. They don't care about the rest of the world, right? So if you guys are having problems, they don't care. So I think people are much less concerned about the sort of the U.S. international standing and much more concerned about how they are doing materially. So I think in order for there to be a large-scale shift to a pushback against this creeping authoritarianism, I think you need some economic damage to occur first. And so far, that hasn't been strong enough to mobilize people. So I'm a little nervous.
Lavínia Barros de Castro, please.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It's always so insightful to listen to you. So you explored in your lecture about the codependence between China and U.S. in terms of trade, in terms of manufacturing, inputs, technology, and so on. And I would like to listen a little bit more in terms of the dollar system dependence on China, buying debt, and so on. And the part B of the question would be your opinion on Mar-a-Lago discussion.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not a believer in the Mar-a-Lago Accord. I thought that was always a fantasy. So that's my view on the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Based on false analogies to the 1980s when the only economies that mattered in the world were the U.S., Japan, and Germany. Germany and Japan were U.S., not even allies, they were sort of vassal states. So if the U.S. said to those guys, you have to revalue your currencies, they would. The notion that anyone in today's economy would do such a thing, I think, is just lunacy, frankly. So these ideas of a sort of a grand currency bargain, I think were always misguided from the start. In terms of the dollar system, I've always felt that the dollar system was incredibly resilient, very powerful. It benefits from network effects. I use the dollar because you use the dollar and everyone else uses the dollar. The system on which this sits of the U.S. Treasury market is enormously deep and enormously complex, and there is no substitute for it. So these stories about, we'll in China or Europe, we'll sell our U.S. Treasury reserves, and then the question is and then you will buy what with that money? And there is no answer unless you basically just want to go back to gold, which is not practical for various reasons. So I think there's enormous resilience within the dollar system. It works extremely well. There is no single other currency that is able to replace it. And the notion that you could replace it with multiple currencies, I think, falls down because essentially, once you start doing the arithmetic of the transaction costs involved in trading multiple different currencies instead of everyone basically trading with the dollar, it escalates very, very quickly. So there just is not a practical alternative for ordinary purposes. Now, what I mentioned earlier was that the Chinese, I think, have recognized this, and so they've scaled back their ambitions for internationalizing the renminbi. But they've doubled down on the digital currency issued by their central bank. And again, I think the most useful way to think about this is what people really want is, in normal times, they want to be able to use the US dollar because that's easy, right? But they also don't want to get whacked by US sanctions. So they want an alternative to use not every day, but in case of emergency. And I think that is basically what China and its partners in these digital currency things are trying to do, is create a system that is an emergency vehicle for transactions outside the dollar system, not to be used in normal times, but to be used in abnormal times. And even that, I think, is very difficult to pull off. The mechanics, not the technological mechanics, but the cross-border governance mechanics of digital currencies are actually very, very difficult to solve. So this is a problem I think that people don't really appreciate how hard it is to switch out of the system. So basically, I still think the dollar system continues to function. Again, if Trump really decides to withdraw into Fortress America, sever economic links with the rest of the world, and undermine U.S. credibility and power in multiple ways, I think that will be tested. But for the moment, I'm pretty confident that the dollar system can sustain itself.
So,
Probably have time for one more.
so let's combine two,
Okay.
Edmar Bacha and Marcelo Lins, and then we conclude. And then let's have yours and Edmar.
First of all,
Quick question.
okay. First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. Very enlightening, as somebody said there. And I like to think you just talked a bit about the relationships between the U.S. and the Europeans, and this destruction that we've seen for the last couple of months in this relationship, and the mistrust also that the Europeans have regarding China.
Yeah.
So, in your view, where will be the Europeans looking at when they are looking for a reliable partner? If it's not China, but can they trust Donald Trump? Can anybody in the world today trust Donald Trump when they're thinking about planning investments and where they are going, including his partners here in South America, or even in the battlefield of Africa, which seems like China has won already, but I don't know if it's a correct assumption.
Yep. Okay. And then the other one. Yeah. We can combine it all. Yep.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. My question is about the China economy. Most people asserts, that the problem of China is excess capacity, and that they need exports in order to complement domestic demand. And looking ahead, this would be a big issue from the demand side.
Yep.
Right? I always wonder about that because my question is not, if you look at the trade balance of China, it's only today, it used to be 10%, but today it's only 2% of GDP.
Right.
So
Yep.
Exports are basically, from the demand side, annulled by imports.
Yep.
What is really at issue, from the way I see it, is that investment, it's such a huge share of total demand vis-a-vis domestic consumption.
Yep.
So that looking ahead, the problem is not so much replacing exports by domestic demand, but replacing investment, especially in construction, by consumption.
Yep. Okay, and then one more. Okay, that's it. Okay. Okay, yeah, good questions both. On the European thing, you absolutely cannot trust Donald Trump, and if anyone doesn't get that by now, I'm sorry, I can't help you, right? The evidence is just overwhelming and uncontradicted by anything. And I think the longer term question is, for Europe is, can you trust the American people, right? Because they elected him twice, even after he made some pretty disastrous errors and sort of a failed putsch the first time around. So I think that's the deeper question is, can you trust a country that is willing repeatedly to put itself in the hands of such a person? And I think the answer is you need to tread very carefully. The history is that the Americans have done a lot of crazy things over the years, and we have managed to get ourselves back on track. So you can build some hopes around that, but you have to hedge against the possibility that the United States becomes something much worse, which is why I think it is a very good decision that the Germans made to get rid of their debt brake and start standing properly on defense. I think it makes enormous sense for Europe to pay more for its defense, not because they've been ripping off the United States and this is bad for the U.S. It's bad for Europe that they have lived in this fantasy world for so many decades where they did not have to pay for their own security. That is just an unhealthy place to be, and you are much more robust and resilient as a society if you pay the full costs of defending yourselves. So I think that's a very healthy development. I think, clearly Europe in general and Germany in particular has a lot of space to operate fiscally to ramp up spending, not only on defense, but on all kinds of infrastructure and other things that they desperately need. So I think just some more independence is a good route. Deal with the U.S. when and where you can and where you must, and there's a lot potentially to be gained there, but just be more self-reliant. And obviously the problem for Europe is the political fragmentation, right? This really makes it very, very difficult to sustain a national mission in the way that the U.S. can or that China can. And that's kind of beyond my pay grade to how they solve that problem. But I think what we've seen so far, just in these fiscal measures, I think it's very promising that is the direction. Rely more on yourself. Don't worry about the rest. And then, yeah, I totally agree with what was just said about the Chinese economy. I think we got sidelined for political reasons by this excess capacity discussion, which was not a good description of what's going on. Indeed, the problem in China is essentially one of overinvestment. I think that what is interesting is the government has now said repeatedly in the last several months that they recognize this as a problem and that they really want to focus much more on creating sustainable domestic demand, meaning domestic consumption demand, right? And this is new. Previously, when they've talked about domestic demand, they've meant investment demand, right? But now I think they really understand that you need the consumption side. And the problem is, how do you do that? You spent 40 years building a machine which is brilliant at maximizing investment, right? You have done nothing to create the machinery, fiscal, financial, or otherwise, to create a demand-driven economy, and now you have to start working on that. So I totally agree with your analysis of the problem, and I think the Chinese government is slowly beginning to recognize the validity of that. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take a very long time to create the mechanisms for sustained demand-driven growth. And what that means is that, okay, it's true that China's trade surplus is not that big, but its share of global exports is very large, and particularly in manufacturers. So they're making their structure of production makes it very, very difficult for any other country that wants to have a manufacturing sector to do that. So I don't think that the magnitude of the trade surplus is the issue here. The issue is, can other countries sustain the production structures that they want in the face of Chinese competition? A lot of countries increasingly think the answer is no, and that's going to create a lot of friction. So that's, I think, where we are. And unfortunately, I have to catch a car to get to my next meeting. But thank you very much
Thank you
for this
so
great discussion.
much, Arthur. Looking forward for next year. So Arthur has to go, mas vou aqui passar em português, porque a gente não poderia deixar de mencionar, né, o falecimento ontem do embaixador Marcos Azambuja, que contribuiu tanto para o SEBRE desde a fundação e era um amigo de todos nós, então vai fazer muita falta. Fico com muita pena dele não poder ver essa sede pronta, mas viveu muito bem. E eu queria também que o Pedro falasse um minuto sobre o nosso querido Marcos.
Pode ser menos de um minuto. Nós nos acostumamos a ouvir nas reuniões do SEBRE o brilhantismo que o Marcos Azambuja, ao final, fazia um comentário onde ele exprimia a sua fulgurante inteligência, o seu inigualável e sutil senso de humor e uma sabedoria, um saber de experiência feito. O Marcos, quem o conheceu, certamente admirou, como eu admirei, conhecimento de décadas. Marcos foi muito importante na época como foi embaixador, secretário-geral do Itamaraty, embaixador do Brasil na Argentina, embaixador do Brasil na França, e um dos pilares da construção do SEBRE aqui ao longo dessas décadas. É com um enorme pesar que nós tomaremos medidas para expressar a nossa gratidão e o apreço e o quanto nós sentimos e sentiremos a sua falta, e vamos expressar isso de alguma maneira. Estava acertando com a Júlia aqui agora, o Marcos estava trabalhando num livro, não sei quantos de vocês sabiam, ele já tinha o título era um título memorável, chamar-se-ia Memórias Quase Póstumas, e ele estava trabalhando já há algum tempo, e eu insistia com ele, Marcos, você tem que publicar. Ele disse assim, não, mas eu ainda não terminei, eu não sei se eu vou conseguir terminar. Eu digo, Marcos, você chame de Memórias Quase Póstumas, volume 1. Depois você escreve o volume 2 e o volume 3, nos anos que você seguramente terá. Não foi possível fazê-lo, mas acho que nós temos uma responsabilidade, os seus amigos, de fazer com que a sua obra, que estava bem avançada, possa ser concluída, que eu acho que é uma derradeira homenagem que nós devemos prestar à sua imagem tão querida. Eu consigo imaginar ele agora encerrando com alguma piada genial o que nós acabamos de ouvir, agradecendo o brilhantismo do nosso orador. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Crabb. It was a brilliant presentation.
Obrigada, Pedro. Todas as homenagens vão ser feitas pelo SEBRE aqui, várias homenagens, o livro, um seminário também com depoimentos, e o Marcos vai estar muito presente. Com certeza a gente vai ter uma sala aqui na nova sede chamada Marcos Azambuja. Obrigada a todos.